Hi, and welcome to today's session on systematic, or I should say, systemic bias in internet, search engines, and scholarly databases. This is probably one of my favorite topics to talk about. It might be just because I'm a librarian, but honestly, I hope you'll find some interest in it as well. Because honestly, what we're going to be discussing is kind of a more recent topic in regards to the nature of internet search engines and scholarly databases as we depend on them to find evidence. I think a lot of the times we often focus on, when we talk about source evaluation, we often talk about evaluating a particular article or a book or some other piece of evidence or information as to its authority, its credibility, currency, and so on, and also identifying any sort of biases that might be located in the piece. But what this session is really going to do is introduce us to the idea that maybe we also should be applying that same type of evaluative mindset when it comes to the search tools that we're using to find evidence in the first place. And especially nowadays, as we come to heavily depend on these type of tools and technologies to inform us, not only in terms of our personal lives when we need certain types of information, like when we ask questions from Google, or even for more essential type of information pieces in terms of, in this case, we're going to be probably focusing on health information and how search engines and scholarly databases can assist us and maybe pose some barriers in this at the same time. And then also in terms of as practitioners or as researchers, we are heavily dependent on these type of tools. And so it calls on us, like how much faith are we putting into these engines or databases to find what we need? And maybe that faith has come uncritically. And so really we're going to put on our critical thinking caps essentially through this. So I'm really excited to talk about this. And if you have any questions, especially because maybe it's fairly unfamiliar or even new to you, feel free. So this particular event is actually in line with a series that has come across through the entirety of fall 2021 trimester. And we've basically gone through several different types of events and programs that have discussed in some length or form regarding equity and justice in research. As you can see, there was plenty of them coming through since September, and we're at the last one, folks. So thank you all for joining this one. This will be the last event for this particular series, at least for the fall. We'll definitely have this in the spring and forward on. Honestly, we'll probably be expanding it, innovating it, revising it based on your feedback and your own experiences with it. But basically the whole through line for all of these very seemingly disparate type of events is this sense of equity, justice, and particularly with the lens of intersectionality, which we discussed more earlier on in the sessions. But basically it's a theoretical lens that we're applying to our research, to our evidence-based practice that accommodates or at least identifies the relationships that different social statuses or identities that we might have with us and how they inform our lived experience, especially as it comes across with race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, geographical location, and so on, and how they all interlock with each other and intersect in different ways and influence each other to basically composite our unique lived experiences on a day-to-day basis, especially as we navigate research landscapes, healthcare settings, and so on. And basically with the systemic bias webinar tonight, we're going to be discussing that in some context as well. So for the agenda for tonight is that I'll provide a short introduction about myself, just so you can kind of have a sense of grounding of who I am as a so-called expert when I'm facilitating this particular session. so you have a better idea of who I am. And in its own way, be able to evaluate my own positionality within this information that I'm providing and presenting. And then also we're going to be talking about probably a concept that's not familiar to you, maybe it is information privilege. We're going to discuss what exactly is that and how that relates to equity and justice. And then we'll get into the meat of things with the internet search engines and scholarly databases and how systemic bias, and maybe also defining what exactly systemic bias is, and more in particular, identifying how it manifests differently across different types of search tools. In this case, internet search engines versus scholarly databases. And then with time permitting, we may participate in a down the rabbit hole activity that I have planned out, but we'll see by the end of this. So for introduction purposes, this is basically me. I thought it would be good enough to provide a picture of me. That way you have a visual representation of who I am. But in terms of some pertinent information, especially as we were talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think it is really important to provide some transparency as to who I am when I'm facilitating these type of events. My name is Matthew Chase. I am a librarian specifically located in the San Marcos campus of the University of St. Augustine for Health Sciences. So maybe we've met if you're on the San Marcos campus. In that case, hello. If you're not on that campus, also hello, but probably from a different time zone and location, obviously. Also, for clarity purposes, I am a white USian, meaning that I am an inhabitant and citizen of the United States. I'm also cisgender male, heterosexual, and also heteroromantic. Basically, an abbreviated version of that would be cishet in that case. I do go by the he, his, him pronouns. And one last thing I usually like to talk about is being a critical optimist and what that means. Basically, what it means is I'm an optimist. I believe things can get better. I think we can improve upon things. I don't think things can and should remain the way they are in terms of talking about disparities and inequities and so on, that they are in need of address and that we can improve upon them. But I'm also critical. How are we measuring that type of success, that type of change? How are we actually doing it? Are we really involving the voices that need to be heard in that sense? So in that sense, why I put critical optimist in particular. So now we can get into the actual meat of things here. Basically, what we want to do is provide a certain type of lens to really analyze systemic bias as it regards to internet search engines and scholarly databases. And intersectionality is definitely a useful tool for that, or a lens, but probably a way to get more specific as to how we can apply intersectionality in terms of talking about those social statuses and identities that we have and how that formulates our experiences when it comes to navigating these different types of search tools. A more specific and relevant concept from that would be information privilege. Basically, information privilege is the opportunities, advantages, rights, and affordances that we have when it comes to accessing and creating information. Particularly, and I think this is something to stress as well, information that is tailored to reflect oneself. This particular privilege is conferred and enabled by our own social statuses when it comes across to race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality, socioeconomic situations, geographical locations, even culture, and probably another really important aspect is institutional membership. Basically, our membership to certain types of institutions. We could say in terms of the university, that it would be our membership as either a student, a staff, or a faculty. It could also be to other types of institutions like employers and so on. And really that can also determine our access to information. Another really great factor, or maybe not a great factor, but a very important factor to consider is also language is another aspect that we need to consider. Information privilege has recently come into the social justice discourse as it relates to the systemic inequities of access, representation, production, and dissemination of information, particularly as with these questions that I've outlined here. What we really need to ask ourselves, especially when we consider information privilege and how some people have privilege and some people don't, or they have different levels of it in different contexts, we really have to ask ourselves, who has access to information? I think this is probably the most basic question that is kind of revealed by information privilege. But we also need to ask ourselves, who's represented in that information? Again, when I was kind of defining how that information is tailored to reflect oneself, that's assuming that you have the privilege of finding information that reflects you. And then also, who can produce information? Who gets to write up the research? Who gets to seek out funding opportunities to conduct research in the first place? And then also, whose information is disseminated? Maybe you could conduct all the research that you needed to, but is your research going to actually be published? How hard is it going to be for you to actually get it published through a presumably prestigious journal versus having to find something else that might be of a cheaper affordance? Maybe you just can't afford the article processing charges through a particular journal that you actually would have otherwise wanted to publish through, or anything else going on, especially when it comes to barriers with peer review and editorial boards as well. There's been noted issues when it comes to race and to gender in that regard as well, in terms of who gets represented in those boards and those peer review pools. So one of the things about information privilege is that it has a significant impact on many spheres of our everyday lives, ranging from our access and production of financial information, legal information, and probably for us, probably more relevantly, health information. And so as a result, it's important to note that information privilege conveys this reality of inequity of information, this information inequity, in which many individuals, groups, and communities, and even countries may not have the power, resources, and or affiliations to access information or produce it even. And so as a result, information privilege and inequity can intersect with many other sites of systemic inequity across, again, like we're talking about race, gender, class, etc. And so your experience with privilege can manifest in some ways, and then you may experience inequity in other situations as well. And so with that type of lens, basically, we can now really kind of dive deeper into how information privilege really influences and shapes our navigation through search tools, in our cases, internet search engines and scholarly databases. And for our purposes, what we really need to ask ourselves then is, what is systemic bias? What is that in comparison to other types of biases? Systemic bias, probably the shortest way to describe it would be that it is a structural inherent tendency to support certain outcomes. And this has two important elements to focus on here, one being the structural inherent element, and then also the supporting certain outcomes element. So in this case, what we're talking about is that this type of bias is not accidental. It's not individual, like it doesn't just happen on chance or by certain circumstances. Basically, what this means by saying it's structural or inherent is that it is baked in to the system. It is embedded into the to the particular institution or procedure or language even. And in this case, when we're talking about search engines and scholarly databases, this can be represented in terms of the algorithms that are designed to help you search for things. And those type of algorithms may have tendencies that can systemically bias you away from certain types of information or not, or towards information that doesn't represent you. And that to us leads us to the second element, the supporting certain outcomes. In this case, the outcomes is basically probably the most representative or visualizable part of it is the results of your search, right? If you go through a Google search or through a search through one of our databases, essentially you're gonna generate a list of results. Now, what gets ranked as being on the top of the list is ultimately dependent on the a relationship between the algorithms, how they interacted with the keywords you put in, and any other associated factors. And we'll actually go into those other factors as we go into it. It's not just going to be about like what keywords you put in. There's going to be other aspects to consider as well. And some of which are either invisible to you, and so therefore you may not notice, or it's completely out of your control. It's completely just dependent on the system itself. In this case, either the search engine or the database. And so with that, now we can dive even deeper and go into the aspects of how the systemic bias manifests within internet search engines. Now, when I'm talking about internet search engines, what I'm really talking about is any type of search engine that accesses the open web. This could be Google, it could be Bing, it could be Yahoo, it could be whatever your choice is, essentially. There's plenty of other types of search engines that are being developed, and some have different types of user interfaces and different types of features depending on like who made it and who they made it for. But essentially, most internet search engines, or pretty much all of them, have a basic fundamental, which is algorithms. And these are algorithms that are enabled to adapt to a user's search behavior. So, and that way it's personalized. It's actually trying to customize the algorithm to what keywords you're inputting. It could be to what type of search history you've already developed from past searches as well. And so on. And then also even correlating that with other users who may have had similar types of search histories or search patterns or search behaviors. And so as a result, search engines can respond to your behavior by changing the search results based on your personal preferences. Internet search engines are in part designed to satisfy your search inquiries with information that is familiar or agreeable to you, or at least what the algorithm or search engine thinks is agreeable or familiar to you, which can lead the results to omit or completely just remove certain types of evidence or information, particularly contradicting information that the search engine designates as less likely to be of interest to you. The personalization of information that you're searching then is compounded as our internet search behavior is highly prejudiced by itself. Like we're just very highly prejudiced creatures, I guess. We often have a strong faith in the evidence that is retrieved and shown by internet search engines, preferring the top-ranked search results even when they are not as relevant to our topics or questions. It's mainly because we're just trusting that the search engine knew better than what we were looking, knew better than what we knew. So as a result, we are more likely to choose positive or affirming information over negative or contradicting information. This often kind of correlates with cognitive biases that we already have as human beings in terms of cherry picking information or confirmation bias, just seeking out information that already confirms prior attitudes or beliefs that you've already held. And we've already talked about cognitive biases in a previous webinar, so if you ever have any, if you're interested in that, feel free to attend another one that's probably coming up next year, or we do have a recording of that as well, in case you're interested. And so as a result of this personalization of search information, we are essentially enabling this type of filter bubble effect. It's the proclivity for internet search engines to curate information based on our preferences and behavior, and it produces a personal selection bias in which the information available to a user is structured or curated again according to our pre-existing beliefs and attitudes. Unfortunately, there is a lack of transparency when it comes to internet search engines regarding what criteria these search engines are personalizing information, or like what criteria are they basing it off of. While some internet search engines will allow users to use more advanced searching techniques such as Boolean logic, which you also learn a lot from your librarians here at the university, they're not adequately comparable to the more robust features offered by scholarly research databases. Google and other search engines in turn heavily depend on these personalized algorithms for the evaluation and prioritizing of search results. For example, a user like myself will be directed to utilize the country-specific version of a search engine. So in this case, say because I live in the United States, basically if I were using Google, it would automatically default to the United States version of Google. There actually are different versions of Google depending on where you live. The search engine will typically include variations and synonymous terms in my search query. So in this case, what I'm saying is even like say you put a certain types of keywords into the search, it's actually adding other types of keywords that it thinks is relevant to you as well. But you don't get to see what those keywords are. It's very kind of like hidden in that aspect. Sometimes that can be helpful, but at other times you may not necessarily know what the search engine is prioritizing as a result. And you don't have any control of it either. So this is where we talk about the inequities that can result from algorithms. Basically, even though algorithms are not human, like they're not necessarily subject to the same type of human experience that we all kind of do, they are designed by humans. And as a result, they can still be embedded with certain types of biases that we consider more human. In this case, like racism, sexism, heteronormativity, and so on. And internet search engines can just convey those same type of biases. For example, when you actually try to do a Google search or any type of internet search for skin diseases, both patients and health practitioners are likely to use internet search engines to find and identify examples of acne, eczema, and so on. Yet most images that you'll find are curated and prioritized from a general internet search, which will often show typically white or light-skinned people, with a minority of those images actually being of brown skin or an even smaller percentage representing darker brown or even black skin. Another thing to really consider too is if you do a search for say black women, just using the keyword black women in Google, often what you'll find is very positive type of results actually in the first page. That wasn't always the case. It's only been recently that because there have been these type of criticisms regarding algorithms that actually what showed up a couple of years ago when you searched up black women was actually dating sites, porn sites, other types of fetish type styled websites that would hypersexualize black women. But now if you did a search for black women, it often goes into like public health about black women, like actually good quality sources and so on. So one of the things about that though, and we're talking about Google here, is that these algorithms can be fixed in that regard, right? So it does show that, you know, that they're not necessarily outside of anyone's control. It's still in the control of the designers. But if you did the same search for Asian women, you would actually still see mainly about hypersexualizing Asian women. That's actually something that still exists. If you do a search right now on your own, you'll probably find that, particularly in the ads of Google, particularly. Even though it'll probably show some positive results, like more affirming results about like actual legit resources for Asian women. If you look in the ads specifically, they tend to focus more on dating websites and so on that are targeting about Asian women. And yeah, you could probably do similar searches. I've actually done a couple on like bipolar patients as well. If you do a Google image search, maybe you try to do one about bipolar patients. And if you look at it, it tends to have a very similar pattern of showing bipolar patients as being either deceptive or being like two-sided, two-faced in some way, or having this like unstable, like internal personality. And so as a result, you know, what we really have to consider is like if that's like the way the internet tends to curate, you know, bipolar patients, at least visually, you know, how's that representative of how bipolar patients are seen uh, in, um, in society, just in general. So the question then becomes, how do I mitigate this type of systemic bias when it comes to internet search engines? The problem is there is no way to actually completely remove this type of bias. There's a couple different minor ways you can do it, like certain techniques that I can outline here, but ultimately there's no complete way of eliminating it. But I don't want to necessarily say that means you shouldn't use Google or other types of internet search engines at all. I think it's kind of impossible not to use them in some fashion or form, right? Depending on your access to scholarly databases, say you need to access scholarly databases, but maybe you don't have affiliation as a student to a university or to an employer who can get you access to it. Instead, you have to pay quite a bit of money out of your own pocket to get that type of access. In that case, internet search engines, because they are relatively free in that sense, they're much more preferable in that way. And also I think it's important to regard that our own patients, our own communities are also searching for their own health information on these type of search engines. So I think it's really appropriate for practitioners and students and faculty to be more readily aware of how these type of search engines work as they relate to our own patients and communities' experiences with these type of search tools for their own purposes. But there are a couple ways you can kind of mitigate or help to reduce some of the bias that's embedded in these type of search engines. One is logging out of personal browser accounts, clearing internet search history, disabling internet search history options. There is actually ways where you don't record any type of history as you do your searches. Using anonymous browser options, so essentially like for Google Chrome, I believe the term is incognito, private browsers, or also using advanced search features. And this may be using Boolean searching, other types of limiters that might be provided by search engines. But again, those are pretty limited and not necessarily the most robust in comparison to scholarly databases, but they can help in that regard. Basically, what you're trying to do is try to mitigate how much the search engine is tracking your behavior, in this case, search history, keyword use, and so on. But again, even when you're using an incognito browser, it's still tracking your behavior before you close out the browser and erase all that history. So it is still influencing it as you're doing the search. So again, that's why you can't necessarily eliminate bias in this regard. So we'll go into scholarly databases. So one of the things to talk about here is that even though scholarly databases are preferable when it comes to actually trying to find scholarly evidence, in this case like journal articles and so on, mainly because they help you locate that type of information more readily, and also in some ways provide you access to them. There are still definitely some limitations when it comes to scholarly databases. Namely, one of the things is that even though there are definitely some free databases out there, such as like PubMed actually, which is a leading public or a leading health sciences and medical sciences database that many clinicians use, even though the database itself is free to search, it doesn't mean that the access to articles is free necessarily. There are some free articles that are available through there, but a lot of it is also barriered by a paywall, basically meaning that you either have to subscribe to the specific journal or even try to buy the individual article at cost. And oftentimes you can actually find articles that look great and you may not necessarily have access to them unless you pay like $30 just for the one article. There's even certain ones where you just can only rent the article for like 24 hours. So it ultimately depends on the publishers. And that's actually one of the key moments here of reflecting on our own information privilege, just by aspect of being a student or faculty or staff affiliated with the university. You have access to over 50 different databases and to over 250,000 academic journals and to the full text of those journals. Now imagine someone who doesn't necessarily have that type of access, either as a practitioner or as another student at another university that maybe doesn't have those type of robust resources, and maybe the struggles that can be embedded as a result. And so with this also, there are a couple other factors of where systemic bias can manifest in databases in particular. One of the things is search terms. So even with Google and Bing and all of them, they typically respond pretty well to natural language, which is basically the language that we use on an everyday basis. But if you've attended any of our previous type of library sessions on keyword creation and so on, it's much more complicated with databases. They're much more particular about what they want to see inputted into the search bar. Even though databases like PubMed and even most ProQuest databases are becoming increasingly responsive to keywords based on this type of natural language, the results retrieved from the search are not necessarily the most relevant. Actually, the more naturally you tend to go with your language or keyword use, the farther away in terms of results you get. The reason is that articles, journals, and other information sources in a database can use widely different vocabulary and keywords and terminology. The way that you would articulate a concept could be very different from how most articles on that topic would describe it. And so as a result, designers of scholarly databases will typically work around this problem by developing and integrating a structured set of terminology, a thesaurus, if you will, as a controlled vocabulary. Probably the obvious representation of this would be MESH, which is medical subject headings. Basically, this is a thesaurus of highly curated, highly controlled and structured keywords that the designers behind PubMed use. And actually this same type of thesaurus is also used in many ProQuest databases, CINAHL as a database, and others as well. And basically it's a way of trying to create a very consistent and very standardized type of terminology that everyone can kind of use and access to find articles that may not have those shared type of keywords otherwise. Basically thinking of it as hashtags, essentially. Each of those type of mesh terms can be a hashtag for each article. And that way, if you search that particular hashtag, you can find that article, but also other articles that were assigned that same hashtag, if that kind of makes sense in that case. Sometimes the mesh is, with mesh, you can actually access it through PubMed. There's actually a database point. I'll actually link it in the chat so you can kind of explore it on your own. But you may be also familiar with it. We have some tutorials on it as well. But yeah, let me just put it in the chat really quick for y'all. But yeah, so that's basically its own like database of sorts of mesh where you can actually access different types of terminology. Clinical use. I think this is a really important thing to consider when you talk about scholarly databases and when you're talking about them in a clinical setting context. There are definitely some limitations when it comes to that. While evidence-based practitioners are instructed to draw evidence from the scholarly literature, the interface for most scholarly databases, like PubMed, are not necessarily designed to assist the practitioner in the clinical setting. Scholarly databases are predominantly intended and designed to be used by researchers and students, providing the tools to search the literature in a much more comprehensive way. Yet clinicians may find themselves hard-pressed and limited on time to perform these type of comprehensive literature searches in between patient consultations, for example. So it can be very exhausting in terms of time and energy that maybe a practitioner can't afford. There have been some more developments in this regard. PubMed in particular has what it's called clinical queries, which is another type of interface where you interact with PubMed, but in a way that's much more clinician friendly of sorts. But even that has some limitations on that too. There's other tools that have come out too, like Dynamed, which we have a subscription to through the university. But again, you would need to have a paid subscription to that particular resource to use it. And if you don't have it either personally because you can't afford it, or you're not affiliated with a certain institution that has access to it, then it's more hard pressed, right, to use those type of tools. Selection criteria. So the thing is, with each database, they all differ in terms of what type of information gets curated and recorded into their records. Although digital technology allows for increasing storage and organization, given that there are hundreds of thousands of academic journals published around the world every day, most scholarly databases will only include literature that reflects their required criteria. Each database maintains their own unique selection criteria, but there are many common overlapping factors that are considered, such as the number of times that an article is cited, the impact factor of the journal, which is basically the number of citations that a journal receives compared to how many articles are published on a yearly basis, the relevance of the journal to the database's focus, which we'll talk about in a moment, whether the journal is peer-reviewed, type of information published in the journal, such as type of publications, the methodologies that are being highlighted, and study designs. And another factor is the language of the journal as well, in terms of what language is published in that journal. And these are all deciding factors of whether or not a journal will be included in a database such as PubMed or maybe CINAHL and others. And so as a result, there are certain factors that will exclude certain journals, maybe perhaps more likely less prestigious journals that are located outside of the United States or the Western globe. That might be more published in like Africa or Asia and so on, even though those particular continents and their countries within are increasingly becoming more present in the research landscape, their visibility can be very limited if they're only publishing within their own native language, which is totally within their right to do so. But unfortunately, there are databases that only accept English, for example, as the predominant language. And English has become the predominant language within the language landscape, within the research landscape, which has had consequences for the visibility of researchers, of journals that are trying to, provide to this evidence-based movement, but are not getting the recognition that they rightly deserve. And so that also affects your own search in terms of like, are you actually being able to find those type of articles that are less visible, less recognized, and less cited as a result. And because they're getting less cited, which is a traditional metric of a success of a journal or the success of a researcher, they may get less funding. So there's socioeconomic impact as well. Subject bias. So The last kind of factor I wanted to consider here is that scholarly databases tend to be located in one of two categories. They either are a specialist database or a multidisciplinary database. A specialist database are typically designed to focus on a specific range of topics, disciplines, or fields, while multidisciplinary databases are inclined to include literature from a wide variety of academic disciplines and fields. So PubMed, for example, would be a specialist database because it specializes more in the health sciences and the literature. While, say, Web of Science does a much more multidisciplinary approach. It tends to include literature from different types of fields beyond the health sciences. And given the increasing importance of interprofessional approaches in healthcare, which is something that I know our faculty and students focus on a lot in terms of dialogues and so on, practitioners and researchers are faced with the need to search across the variety of specialist and multidisciplinary databases that are available to achieve a more comprehensive look at the available literature. Yet it also means being aware of how each database reinforces certain frames of reference and approaches more so than others. One example would be how PubMed, particularly the database behind that, behind PubMed, which is Medline, has a bias, actually, in terms of the type of articles that are included. The bias is toward pathology. Basically, PubMed typically curates articles and literature that mirrors the bias in the U.S. healthcare system and general medicine, and that something must be wrong in order to fix it. And this is something that definitely happens within the biomedical spheres and the life sciences. So as a result, topics that position themselves away from pathology, from the fields of it, are less likely to be included and therefore findable in databases like PubMed. Another example would be, while you may find some literature concerning education-related type of concepts and other types of situations as they relate to health and medical sciences in PubMed, the more generalized publications on education, just general education as a whole, you're probably going to better discover those types of literature in databases like ERIC, which focuses specifically on education. I think with the remaining time that we have, depending on how we get through this, I do have a short activity to kind of navigate what it's like to be a researcher or a practitioner going down the rabbit hole of algorithms and other types of systemic bias. So let me move this over into our activity. Cool. So for this, I have a short thing here, and basically what I'm going to do from, it's basically a choose your own adventure type thing. It's going to be very short, I promise. But basically, as the introduction states here, it's about, applying the skills that we're talking about, the knowledge about mitigating systemic bias and navigating it. And so in this type of game, you'll be assuming the role of a researcher working on a literature search for a public health topic. So that's going to be important to note, is that it's about public health. So with this, I'm going to start. And basically, you wake up in front of your computer. And what do you do? So let me publish a poll really quick. It actually gives all the different options, and I'm going to have a vote on which one we should pursue. Let me do the poll really quick. Watch that. So I'll give a few seconds for it. Ooh, looks like we're conflicted on two different choices. Oh, three different choices. All right. So I'm going to go with the majority here, which is drink some coffee. So I'm going to end the poll here. I'm going to share the results. That way you know I'm doing this transparently. The coffee is cold. You almost spit it out. What do you do? So let me share another poll. There you go. Someone wants to go back to sleep. A couple people do. Nice. Okay, I'm going to end poll. It seems like we're at a tie. So for the sake of time, the go back to sleep would essentially end the game because you basically missed out on your deadline for the research project. But, so we'll go to look at your computer. You realize you still need to search the evidence for a research project. So we're going to start searching. As you begin your search, you need to mitigate the effects of algorithmic bias, which is also known as systemic bias as well. What do you do? So I'm going to share another poll. And go for it. And there's no right or wrong answers. We're just having some fun here, navigating. Interesting. All right, I'm going to end the poll here because there is a clear majority. Use a different search engine from the one that you normally navigate. You remember that all internet search engines are designed with algorithmic biases. You reconsider what might be an effective debiasing strategy here. Basically, what's happening is because any of the search engines are still going to curate your information, they would still have that type of problem. So I'm going to relaunch again just to see if you all have a different opinion. Switch to an anonymous incognito browser. There's also look for only EDU websites. What do you all think? So, looks like there's a clear majority in this case. It looks like it is. Someone else still wanted to do another search engine. I admire the persistence. But yeah, so essentially the majority said switch to an anonymous incognito browser. And if you were to do the only EDU websites, you're still going to have the problem of algorithmic bias. It may only choose certain types of EDU websites, and not all .edu websites are necessarily credible. I think that's really something important to understand. And I actually do talk about that in other webinars. I just didn't focus on it here, but that is actually the case where not every .edu means it's going to be a good website to use or even relevant to you. So we're going to switch to an anonymous incognito browser. You know using an anonymous browser is useful to limit the effects of the filter bubble on your results. Although you also know that these strategies only mitigate systemic bias, but cannot remove it entirely. So let me go to the next poll here, results. You find some evidence-based information, but not as much as you initially expected. What do you do? This one might be interesting because I don't think I've talked about the value of what you can actually get from Google and other types of internet search engines, maybe not to a greater extent as I would have liked. But actually, I like the current majority, actually. So, the current majority said find background information about your topic. I totally agree. I think that is one of the great things about using internet search engines is because you can find different aspects of it that you would probably not be able to find in a research article, because a research article is going to be very specific as to the study it's talking about. A lot of internet sources are probably going to talk about more of an overview, which may give you more ideas about the background information about your topic. The other one, though, I did see about using it for keywords. I would also agree. There might be certain keywords that you would not have thought of unless you had done the search and saw that others were using different types of keywords to describe the same thing. But we're going to go with find background information. You find a great deal of background information to inform your understanding of and approach to the topic. So I'm going to relaunch another. All right. So this I did not talk about as much, but I would love to hear your thoughts about what would you do. The first result directs to a website created by 2 health sciences relating to your topic. What do? Do you save it as a possible reference for your research? Do you check the currency of the website? Do you check the authority of the website? Or do you check the website for other biases? Check the authority. I see some options there. I see some for currency. I see some for other biases. Cool. I like to see it. Awesome. I'm going to share the results here. So it seemed like there was a tie between checking the authority of the website and other biases and currency. Honestly, the answer would be all three of these, mainly because there's going to be different factors to what characterizes what is a credible website. You don't want to just automatically save it as a possible reference, even though maybe you'll look back on it later, but it also kind of means maybe you won't devote as much time the next time to really check the currency and authority. Maybe you'll already have done the work now and don't have to reconsider it later. Basically, you could go through all these. I'm going to go through the bottom option, mainly because that's the last one. So, but to acknowledge that all of you are correct in those answers. You start noticing that all the information is directing you to purchase herbal remedies and medical devices from the website store. It also dawns on you that the website was not the first result in your search, but rather an advertised website selected by the internet search engine based on your keywords. You switch to Google Scholar to find more reliable literature. Now, Google Scholar is really interesting because it does help you find more specific scholarly literature, but there are problems with that as well. One of which is this paywall problem, which I'm going to put in the poll. You found a relevant article through Google Scholar, but it is behind a paywall. It would cost $32 to purchase it. What do you do? Let's see. Majority. Ooh. Seems like there's a tie. Oh, now there's a majority. I'll end it there. So I see that the most people had said request the article through interlibrary loan with the USAHS library. That is probably the best option here. You can do the checks Google Scholar for open access links, which is a very useful way of using Google Scholar in the first place. But there are going to be times that you may not find an open access option for yourself, and it still requests for you to pay for it. So before you do that, though, as a student or anyone who's affiliated with the university in some way, even as an alumni, request it through interlibrary loan. It's free for you, so it's way better. Because of your affiliation with the university, the librarian confirms that you should receive the full text soon. You decide to redirect your search to the scholarly databases. So we're nearly at the end here. So you consider which database would be best to start searching. Now, one of the things to consider is that you are looking for a public health topic. And that's pretty much all it's been described, but it was about public health. So based on that, what do you think would be the best database to start with? Oh, let me launch it. There we go. All right, there was an immediate majority. Everyone said it was pretty much PubMed. I would definitely agree. This one's education, this one's more sports medicine, this one's more psychology. PubMed would probably be the best bet for public health. Yeah, so we'll continue. I'm not going to go through this one. I didn't talk about mesh as much as I would have liked in terms of like how do you actually identify which one of these would be the best. Essentially, it would have been socioeconomic factors and Mexican Americans, because these are two mesh factors that would have been more relevant about the socioeconomic status and health for Mexican Americans. These other ones have a mix of mesh as well as keywords or natural language. So they wouldn't have been as specific as these two right here at the bottom. You become much more specific in your search. So last one, actually, and luckily we're at it's perfect because we're at the end of the hour. So launching the poll, you get up from your computer, make a fresh and hot cup of coffee this time, and plan what to do next. What do you do? All right, there was an immediate majority. I'm gonna stop there, share it. Cool. Everyone pretty much said evaluate sources and explore other databases. That is pretty much the go-to message here. you don't want to necessarily just automatically start writing a review of the literature, because you don't necessarily know that all your articles are the most reliable, the most credible, the most relevant to what you're looking at. It's always good to evaluate the sources, and more importantly, evaluate the search tools that you used. In this case, you only use Google Scholar and PubMed, which isn't necessarily the most comprehensive, right? So awesome, love it. And then at that point, it's game over. Thank you for playing. So I really enjoyed that, doing that all with you. And actually, I'm really glad we did it within the time and pretty much end it here. I mean, I loved having this conversation with all of you. I'm going to end this poll really quick for you so you don't have to keep seeing it. But yeah, that was awesome. Basically, this is kind of the end of the context event series. It was super great to do throughout the trimester. I can't wait to do it again next term. But yeah, if there's any questions, any thoughts that you want to kind of leave with before you head off for the night, I'd love to hear them. I guess the other thing too is if you could, provide any feedback about the event. I would love to hear it. I have actually a very short survey. It's completely optional, but I would love to hear any constructive feedback about it, especially because everyone was really participating in this. I really enjoyed having that. So, but yeah, if you ever want to contact me, my email is also, I'll put it in the chat for your convenience. I love talking about these different types of issues when it comes to social justice and equity and inclusion. How do we really incorporate that into our evidence-based practice and research? But yeah, thank you so much, everyone. But yeah, feel free to stay on. I'll keep on until the very last person. But yeah, thank you so much again.
Thank you. It was very interesting.
Thank you. Yeah. It's one of my favorite topics, honestly. I think it's just more the librarian nerd in me about it. But yeah, thank you.